Now that I've poked a hole into the wall, it's time to start cutting the trunking and putting it together. The straight bits of trunking come in 3-meter lengths, so I had to get some sawhorses to keep the whole thing stable. I transferred one of the markings so that I have both on the same face. These aren't my cutting lines, they represent the thickness of the wall. The 90-degree bend is smaller than that, so the connection will be somewhere inside the wall. To figure this out, I'm taking a fitting, lining it up so that it's flush with one side of the wall, and then I trace where it stops. That's my cutting line. I'm transferring that line on the other faces before taking out the angle grinder and starting to slice. I was trying my best to get a straight cut, a hard task made harder because I didn't think of clamping the trunking to the table at the beginning. But it's okay if the cut isn't perfect, since the coupler fittings and the lid covers will deal with any gaps. With this length cut, I went back inside to double check that I didn't cut too short or too long, which fortunately wasn't the case. The next step is to drill the holes to install the coupler on the cut length. The manufacturer does provide measurements for these, but it was simpler to use the coupler as a template. This time, I won't forget to clamp the workpiece down before drilling. If you're using a drill driver, don't forget to put it in drill mode, otherwise you'll be drilling for a while. As you've seen, there is some flexing action happening when drilling near the top of the trunking, so there's a risk of wonkiness, but so far it's been fine for me. After that, I sanded the edges a bit as I don't want any sharp edges tearing into the cables. I'm 99% sure I ended up cutting this nasty sharp edge later, but it seems I have no footage of it. Once the 4 holes were drilled, I installed the fitting, primarily to check that everything's fine. I also installed the lid cover, as you can see, so that the whole connection is covered. Next is installing the turnbuckle clips to keep the lid in place. These you got to measure, because if they're too far in, they won't be able to do their job. You may have noticed that the mark on top and the one on the sides don't match up. The lid has a tendency to slide, as the clips are only there to keep the lid from falling. So if you don't pay attention, you might end up with a lid that's too short somewhere down the line. I don't know if it's the drill bit or the material the lid is made out of, but I can't seem to manage making a round hole with these. I guess I should be using a step drill bit. Here you can see me struggling to fit the clip, which isn't gonna happen until I clean up the tear out, which I'm doing with a file. Make sure this is as flat as possible or the clip won't turn well. Now I can fit the clip in, albeit with the help of some percussive persuasion. Then I make sure the turnbuckle turns easily enough, and repeat the process for the other one. Since this length of trunking will end partway into the wall, I'm going to struggle to take the lid off if I leave it as one section. So I'm going to cut off the piece that is going to remain into the wall. After I remember to put my safety glasses on, that is. I give the freshly cut pieces of lead a bit of sanding before going back to the trunking section, where I mark and drill the holes through which I'll drive the screws to fix it to the wall. Inside, I'll slide the section in place and crawl inside the cabinet. I'm slapping a magnetic spirit level on the trunking and line up the section. These 2 holes are into brick, so I pre-drill with a masonry bit before inserting wall plugs and fixing the fittings with wood screws. The rest of this section is resting against what seems to be a piece of plywood by the sound of it, so I directly fix them with wood screws. Now it's rinse and repeat for the next section. Measure, cut, sand, drill, and fit. The smart thing to do here would be not to run the trunking all the way into the corner, because accessing those screws on the wall side is going to be difficult. But this is a permanent installation, and I have a plan, which, spoiler alert, is going to bite me. The plan was based on the assumption that I would be able to run a long section of trunking from that 90-degree bend all the way into the bedroom upstairs and install the 2 as one unit. I start by preparing the fixings for the 90-degree fitting, as it will help handle the whole section later on. The corner of that ceiling isn't super neat, which is going to interfere with the run, so I'm cleaning this up with a chisel. I'm trying to be gentle to remove as little material as possible. By the way, that piece of tape was to cover a hole I drilled to check that the path was clear. As usual, a little test fit along the way to make sure everything's fine, before chiseling some more. Once all that's done, I traced the outline of the trunking to prepare cutting the plasterboard of the ceiling, the thing I've been dreading this whole time. Note that I'm making a slight mistake here as I'm tracing using bare trunking, when I need to account for the coupler and more specifically the screws that will protrude from it. I'm cutting the plasterboard slowly with a multi-tool, trying to keep the off-cut in one piece in case I need to patch things up later. After cutting the squares, I had to pry the piece of plasterboard out because a nail I couldn't see was keeping it in place against a floor joist. Oh, phooey. Turns out that hole I drilled should have been a giveaway. At this point, I stopped to consider my options. I thought about anchoring the joist to the wall and cut the bit that's in the way, but a conversation with the council's building regulation department told me not to. Turns out this would have been a lot more work, so good call. I just wanted to avoid having to buy more fittings, but there was no way around it, or rather, the only way was around it. But this required more planning. I took a bunch of measurements and 3D modeled the situation to look at my options. I can make a small bump in the trunking just using 4 45-degree bends to make 2 offsets without having to add a straight section in the middle. The other thing is that, as I wondered when I first measured the house, the wall in the kitchen and the wall in the bedroom don't exactly line up. So I will need to extend the second offset by about 5 cm, which luckily is about the shortest length I can make and not have the coupler fittings get in the way of each other. This new plan means I need to cut the ceiling some more. This time, I'm using the fitting as a template to guide the multi-tool, a method that works quite well for making snug fit cuts. It also helped me correct the mistake I made before, which was not accounting for the screw heads. Next, I need to cut the floorboard. I'm drilling a couple of holes through from the bottom to have a reference point. I know those 2 pipes are going to the right, so I'm not worried about cutting into them. I'm using the multi-tool once again for this. It turns out to be a very versatile tool, as the name suggests, I suppose. With that bit of board removed, I'm moving on to assembling the offsets and dropping them in from above. I'm positioning the offset so that I can slide in a piece of plasterboard back in behind it to close the gap. The bonus side effect is that the offset straightens before going into the ceiling, which gives a visual indication of where it's going. Once lined up, I'm making a mark on the wall at the bottom section and do the same at the previous fitting, which allows me to measure the length of the next cut I need to make into the straight section. I'm transferring that measurement into the trunking, which I'm preparing as usual, cutting to length, drilling for coupler fitting and wall fixing. The plan is to assemble the 90-degree bends and the offsets as one piece, though because I cut the ceiling close, I'll have to take out the last 45-degree bend and install it from above. Since I only have one pair of hands, I'm temporarily fixing the 90 in place so I can drill the holes for fixing the straight section. I then took it down to finish drilling and inserting the wall plugs, before putting it back up for permanent fixing. In retrospect, I probably didn't need to remove the trunking to do that, but whatever. Now, it's time to go upstairs to place the last angled piece of the offset. I already added the small extension to it, and since this is against the wall and halfway through the floor, I put the coupler screws inside out so I can tighten them from the inside using a ratchet wrench. With that done, it's going straight up to the next ceiling. Though, before I could do so, I had to get rid of 2 old wasps' nests in the loft that were right in the area where I needed to work. They had been there a while, so I was confident it was safe to remove them myself, but I still took all the precautions to ensure it was empty before I got rid of them. Back to making holes in ceilings. Just like the last one, there's a joist in the way, though I already knew that as this was easier to check. The plan here is to make another offset, but this time I'll have to dig into the wall. However, since the thickness of that wall is unknown, I need to plan the path to minimize how much into the wall I need to go. I'm doing this with my 3D model again, to get an idea of where to start cutting into the wall, bearing in mind that I'm constrained by the joist above. With a vague idea of what I'll be doing, I'm heading back up to the loft and start cutting into the plasterboard along the joist. I used a coupler to get an idea of how far to cut, but ended up moving to cutting from below since I couldn't see the corner of the room from above. With this opening made, I went back into the loft to finish cutting the hole and make space for the fitting. Once the plasterboard was removed, I could see the wall and started chiseling. I went back and forth between chisel and hammer drill according to my impatience versus mistake anxiety levels. You can see me struggling to fit the pre-assembled offset through that gap, but if I had paid attention to my own measurements, I would have realized this would have never fit as is. I couldn't expand the opening that way because the wall was indeed very thin and I had already gone all the way through it. I knew that was a possibility, which is why I was being careful not to poke a hole through the staircase wall. However, in my stubbornness to make the combined fittings fit through the opening, I ended up removing more material than I needed. This is becoming a theme. I left one half of the offset hanging from above and connected it with the other half from below using the same inside-out coupler fixing method. Then I cut into the insulation to make a hole for the trunking. As I mentioned last time, if I had gone with a 100 by 50 mm trunking size, I would have been able to just squeeze past the ceiling joist and avoid all this mess. But hey, live and learn. At this point, I need to wait before continuing. From this spot, I need to go straight to the parting wall on the other side of the house, and then along it so that the trunking can serve the other 2 bedrooms. Problem is, there are more things in the way. These radiator pipes which are going down to the office, and then those beams that go along the direction of the roof. I'm not worried about the radiator pipes, because I'm getting them rerouted anyway. These other beams are the ceiling binders, which are structural elements, so I'll have to run the trunking above the new flooring once it's done. So that's going to be it for now. I'll have to put this project on pause until the radiator work and loft prep are done. See you in the next one.